Hello, my dear friends. You're in the Military with Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 16th of May of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And today we're going to talk, of course, a lot about talks that just have ended on the territory of Turkey, Istanbul. The Russians and the Ukrainians managed to agree at least on something. And you know that these talks were very interesting. They were very weird, very strange, but very interesting. And not just these talks were very strange and interesting. Obviously, the entire week, the entire situation that's been developing since the beginning of this week was very strange and very interesting. And this is very important. I would like to point your attention. I would like to remind you how everything started, because this is very important to understand, and based on this we will be able to make a conclusion whether the Ukrainians are going to accept these Russian new demands or not, because probably this is the most important question we have right now. So if you remember, everything started the last week when Zelensky suggested and proposed the Russian side to begin a 30-day ceasefire. Zelensky stated that he asked Putin, he demanded from Putin to start a 30-day ceasefire on the 12th of May of 2025, so basically the previous Monday. And I'll remind you that there were a lot of ultimatums from Germany, from France, from the United Kingdom, from the United States of America. The Western countries were threatened to Russia with new sanctions. There were scandals, probably bad behavior, lots of probably insults from the Western countries. Zelensky insulted Putin probably for several times, and all those actions had just one purpose: to force Russia to accept this 30-day ceasefire. When talking about the Russian side, they denied everything. They rejected every single proposal, every single threat from the Western countries, and they did not do anything. And of course, despite all ultimatums that we got from the European countries, Ukraine and the European countries themselves accepted the Russian position. Then what we had next, Putin proposed to start talks, direct and conditional talks, the previous Thursday on the 15th of May of 2025. So I'm talking about yesterday's. And after Putin made this proposal, what we got from the Western countries and from Ukraine itself, once again, another wave of insults, ultimatums, demands, proposals. Everything was so powerful from Ukrainian side. Everything was so strong from the Western countries. We remember strong position of Macron, of Keir Starmer, of new Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz. So they were talking so strong as if they were planning to attack Russia on Wednesday before the beginning of these talks of the on Istanbul of the 15th of May of 2025. But what happened next? And I'll remind you another important thing, that Zelensky during the week proposed, and he demanded from the Russian side to Putin. He demanded Russia to send Putin to Istanbul for direct talks with him, with Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. And if you remember, Zelensky several times told us that if Putin would not come, if Putin didn't come to Turkey, then most likely he, the president of Ukraine, would not come as well, and nothing will happen. No negotiations will start on a Thursday without the participation of Putin himself. Lots of ultimatums. This idea was supported by the Western countries, by France, by the United Kingdom, by the United States of America, by Germany. I'll remind you, Donald Trump himself wanted to visit Turkey and to take part in these possible talks between Russia and Ukraine on Thursday. But what happened next? We remember Putin and Russia once again denied everything and rejected every single statement made by the Western countries. The Russians adopted the configuration of their delegation, and the Russians sent this delegation to Istanbul. And what happened next? Once again, ultimatums, insults from the Western countries, a lot of bad words, a lot of bad things came from the Western countries, including significant number of ultimatums in the Russian side, that sanctions, the shadow fleet, money, banking sector, everything would be ruined if Putin doesn't come to Turkey by the end of Thursday of 15 15th of May of 2025. But what happened next? The answer: Putin and Russia denied and rejected everything. And what the Western countries and Ukraine were forced to do: to adopt their own delegation and to begin talks today on the 16th of May of 2025 on the territory of Istanbul. And now we're coming to the most important part of this meeting: Russia's demands to start ceasefire and to finish this war. And Russia demands includes a complete withdrawal of Ukrainian units and Ukrainian forces from 4 regions of, let's say, current situation in Ukraine. When talking about these 4 regions, I would like to remind you what kind of territories we are talking about and what are the Russia's demand. So according to Russians' demands, Ukrainians must, let's say, withdraw their positions and withdraw their troops from this black area. This is the northern part of Kherson direction. The Russians are trying to force and demand the Ukrainians to move all their forces from this area. So once again, this black territory is a part of Russia's demands. Another black territory is the northern part of the Dnipro region. So the Russians want Ukrainians to remove all their units, all their forces from this area as well. Let's talk about the Donetsk region. So this is another territory. The Russians want the Ukrainians to move their forces from this area. As you can see, there are not so many territories left from the June of 2024, and just a small part of Lugansk region. So we are talking about these several, probably hundreds of square kilometers. So these are the demands of the Russian forces and the Russian position. And today we got additional paragraph from the Russian side. Today, the Russians demanded Ukrainians to withdraw their troops from the area of secure zone along the border with Sumy region. So when talking about this, we don't know for sure what exactly the Russians understand under the words of secure zone, but we expect that the Russians were trying to force the Ukrainians and demanded Ukrainian side to retreat from this black zone as well. So these are new Russian demands. And once again, what we saw from Ukrainian side after the Russians announced all these demands, once again, ultimatums, insults, bad words, very probably lots of screams, a lot of actions from Ukrainian authorities, a lot of phone calls between Zelensky, Trump, Zelensky, Macron. So everything as we used to see during Sunday, during Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So when talking about this pattern, it seems that Ukrainians are planning to accept these Russia's demands with the purpose to stop this war and to start this 30-day ceasefire. So very interesting situation. Anyway, let's discuss in details this update, because these talks took place just 2 hours. This is very important situation about them. Another important thing that the Russians, once again, they demanded Ukrainians to withdraw their troops from the territory of these 4 regions. And also the Russians, according to Western media and according to Ukrainian sources, added that if Ukrainians don't remove their forces from these 4 regions, then the Russians would take under control another region, and we are talking about the 5th region. And some sources reported that the Russians most likely were talking either about the Dnipro region or the Sumy region. As for now, we don't know for sure. Later, several pro-Russian resources added that the Russians were talking not about 5 regions, the Russians were talking about 8 regions. The Russians were also talking about Sumy region, Kharkiv region, Dnipro region, but when summarizing all these regions all together, we are going to receive just 7. What is the 8th region? Maybe the Russians were talking about Odessa as well. So as for now, it's very difficult to understand, but one thing we know for sure, that both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, managed to agree on exchange on 1,000 for 1,000 exchange, and this exchange may take place in the near future. For example, today the head of the Ukrainian delegation, Ustem Umerov, said that he knows the date, but he will not say it yet. Later, this information was also confirmed by the Russian side, and according to several resources, Russia-Ukraine negotiations completed. Delegations dispersed statements for the media are being prepared. During the negotiations, the Russians threatened to seize the Sumy region to create a safe zone, said Rada Deputy Goncharenko. The meeting between the delegations of Ukraine and Russia ended immediately after Moscow demanded the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the territories of the DPR, LPR, Zaporozhye and Kherson. And before this, it was reported that the delegation of Russia and Ukraine had not yet decided whether the negotiation round would continue in Istanbul. As for now, we know for sure that the Russians and the Ukrainians are having some consultations with both Moscow and Kiev, with Zelensky and Putin. But also we got very important statement from the Russian side. The Russian delegation, the head of Russian delegation, Medinsky, said that the Russian delegation is satisfied with the results of the negotiations with the Ukrainian side. Medinsky announced a large-scale prisoner exchange of 1,000 for 1,000. Kiev requested a meeting of heads of state. Russia took this into account, but the Russians didn't promise anything to Ukrainian side. Moscow and Kiev agreed to present their vision of a ceasefire. Russia and Ukraine have agreed to detail their proposal for establishing a ceasefire. Later, we got reports from Turkey's side. The Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs reported that both the Russians and Ukrainians agreed to start and to launch or to begin during some period of time another round of talks. You know, currently it doesn't matter what the Russians were talking about, what the Ukrainians were talking about. Of course, both sides, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, were trying to show their own demands or something like this. The most important thing that happened today during the previous 24 hours, that both the Russians and the Ukrainians, it doesn't matter what kind of delegations were with rights or without any rights, both delegations were in the same room without anyone else on the territory of Turkey and Istanbul. This is the first step of the peaceful settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, and this step was made both by the Russians and the Ukrainians despite all difficulties and all scandals and insults we saw during the previous week. And this is obviously was made, and obviously thanks to the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, who made everything he could with the purpose to force both the Russians and the Ukrainians to be in the same room and to begin this process. This is very important, telling the truth. Anyway, we see that today there were just talks, consultations, but at the same time we see that the Russians continue their offensive operation, and we have lots of very interesting updates from the ground. And first, let's talk about the Zaporozhye direction. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions a little bit in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Kamyanska. In this video, by the way, after a very long operational pause, the Russians resumed their attempts to move further in the north and the northwestern directions towards the settlement of Kamensk itself. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians were trying to stop and to slow down the Russians with FPV drones. As for now, we don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to break through Ukraine defense, but obviously they managed to improve their positions to the northwest of the settlement of Lapkova. We made small adjustments on map in Russian favor, so we see that now the Russians are making attempts to move further in the northwestern direction, probably with the purpose to take everything to the south and below the river of Yancherkrak. Now let's move further and let's talk about the South Donetsk direction. As we discussed in the previous video, according to information we have, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Kamenskaya, by the name of Vilne. This village is located in the vicinity of Velika Novoselka, and in this video we can see how Russians were raising their flags in different parts of the settlement. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map, and based on this video, most of the mappers, both pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian and neutral, adjusted their maps as well. Furthermore, several sources reported that not just the village was taken by the Russians, also the most important logistic road between the settlement of Volnaya Polye and the settlement of Novoselka. So we see that the Russians are trying to shorten the lines to improve their logistics before moving further in the western direction, because most likely the battle for Zelene Polye and Novopol is about to start, and the Russians are finished almost everything they need to begin this offensive operation. Both villages are semi-encircled, and we expect that tomorrow the Russians will resume their attempts. Obviously, there are going to be no ceasefire, no 30-day ceasefire, and obviously the Ukrainians have lots of things to think about, and probably someone will agree and accept that it's time for Ukrainians to think about the Russian proposal in more details and probably much deeper than they thought about this in the past. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the situation in the area of Bogatyr. According to information we have, the Russians continue their offensive operation, but yet the Russians haven't managed to establish control over the settlement. I'll remind you that most of the mappers, mainly pro-Russian neutral, have already adjusted their maps in this area, coloring the village of Bogatyr under complete Russian control, but we still see and still continue receiving reports that there are still Ukrainians and that they control the northern and the northwestern parts. Today, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the southern direction. Anyway, despite Ukrainian confirm, we see that this stronghold in the southern part of the village is still under complete Ukrainian control, which is very important because this stronghold is a key stronghold in this direction. If the Russians take control over this territory, Ukrainians will have no chances to hold this territory for a very long period of time. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the Novopavlovka direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. During the previous 24 hours, we got lots of videos where we can see how the Russians were trying to attack Ukrainian positions in the direction of Novosergeyevka and Novonikolaevka. The Russians used their tactics of armored rush with the use of the significant number of vehicles and tanks, infantry fighting carriers, motorcycles, and many other different types of equipment. The Ukrainians were trying to slow down the Russians. The 59th Separate Assault Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine was responsible for this defense operation, and according to this brigade, they managed to stop this attack and to destroy lots of Russian vehicles. But anyway, despite the fact that Ukrainians probably managed to destroy lots of equipment, we managed to find and geolocate one of the points from that video. One of the Russian vehicles was destroyed exactly in this point. So based on this, we came to the conclusion that the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the village of Novosergeyevka from the south, and probably the Russians managed to cross the river of Salon and maybe to answer the southern part of the settlement. So we expect that during the next 24-48 hours we're going to receive additional changes on the ground in this area. Probably they will be unconfirmed, but anyway we're going to receive them. Now let's talk about the Pokrov's direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got lots of very important updates. First of all, the Russians continue destroying the most southern part of the city, the citadel of the city of Pokrovsk. I'll remind you that the Russians are trying to reduce this territory to ruins because the Russians can't move further in the northern direction because the Ukrainians have strong control over this territory, and this is probably the strongest area in the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration. So Ukrainians, by controlling this area, probably allow themselves to be in secure zone. If Ukrainians lose control over this citadel, or if the Russians are able to reduce this citadel to ruins, Ukrainians will have less chances to save control over the city itself. At the same time, according to information we have, the Russians continue improving their positions in the southwestern and in the western part of the city of Pokrovsk and the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Today, several pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians managed to improve their positions and to take under complete control the village of Zverova. So once again, some very reliable pro-Russian resources reported that by the end of the 16th of May of 2025, the armored force of the Russian Federation managed to take under complete control everything inside of this red line. Obviously, if this information is correct, this is something like the beginning of the battle for the city of Pokrovsk itself. And if the Russians are able to move even further and deeper inside of the territory of the city, then the Russians would be able to cut the main supply lines that go in the direction of the city. So we believe that everything inside of this red line is the primary target for the Russians for the next several days. If the Russians are able to do this, Ukrainians will start suffering huge problems in the western and the southwestern, and the most important thing, the Ukrainians will start suffering huge problems with supply and support. I'll remind you that at the same time, the armored forces of the Russian Federation are pushing Ukrainian positions on the eastern flank. Most likely during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions, but we haven't received anything from this area. But when talking about the eastern flank, we understand that currently the Russians are trying to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Novoekonomichna and to take under control this probably dense network of fortifications inside of this area. If the Russians are able to improve their positions on the western and on the eastern flank, as you can see right now in front of your screen, this is going to be the beginning of complete disaster for the armored forces of Ukraine on the territory of the city of Pokrovsk itself. It's going to be basically the beginning of the end of Ukrainian control over this territory. As for the eastern flank, during the previous 24 hours, we got several videos where we can see how the Russians managed to improve their positions in this part of the agglomeration. In this video, we can see several episodes how the Russians were answering the settlement, how the Russians were trying to find and to destroy another Ukrainian position, how the Russians were moving from one building to another. And in the final part of this video, we can see how Russian soldiers were raising Russian flags in different parts of this settlement. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map in the farms to the north of the settlement of Mirolubovka. So the Russians continue improving their positions, but of course, if we compare Russia's activities today and probably yesterday, the day before yesterday, we see that the Russians are less active. Probably this happens due to talks in Istanbul. Now let's talk about the Kliban-Bykskaya direction. As for this area, I believe that icons tell us for themselves. During the previous 24 hours, as you can see, we received lots of videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian positions with FPV drones. So as we can see, the Russians entered the next stage of offensive operation, and now they're trying to clear this area with drones. They're trying to destroy Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian trenches, Ukrainian temporary deployment points, and of course the Russians are trying to destroy Ukrainian vehicles, the Russians are trying to destroy Ukrainian equipment, and the most important, the Russians are trying to establish complete superiority in the sky by destroying Ukrainian drones of Baba Yaga type. So this is the situation on the ground. We see lots of icons with drones. The Russians are not moving right now. They have a lot of job to do with this, but as soon as the Russians finish clearing the territory with FPV drones, they will begin advancing, obviously. But despite these actions, we see that the Russians are moving, but mainly Russian activities were spotted in the western flank of the Kliban-Bykskaya reservoir. And we understand this, and we understand why, because this part of Kliban-Bykskaya pocket is unprotected. There are no trenches, no fortifications. The only barrier that Ukrainian can show is Ukrainian soldiers themselves, and which sometimes is not even a barrier for the Russian army. So they're moving, trying to cut the western flank, and as soon as they finish this, they will most likely begin offensive from the eastern direction with the purpose to cut as many as possible, silence and pockets of resistance of the armed forces of Ukraine. As for the Chasiv Yar direction, as for the Torez direction, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians were finishing stabilization of the front line around the city. You know that now we see that Russians either have already established complete control over the territories around the city of Torez or about to finish the stabilization process. We stop receiving any updates and any probably reports that Ukrainians carried out another counterattack, because basically the Ukrainians lost these possibilities due to the fact that the Russians established control over the main strongholds around the city of Torez. So Ukrainians most likely probably don't have any plans to counterattack the city anymore. Now the Ukrainians are trying to improve their positions on the line between the settlements of Katerinovka, Kliban-Byk, Nilipovka, Plishevka, Alexandra Shultina, and then in the northern direction, Pritiechino, Stupachki. So this yellow line is the next defense belt of Ukraine, where they will try to slow down the Russians and to win probably from 1 week to another month. The Russians are regrouping, obviously. When talking about the city of Chasiv Yar, according to several pro-Russian resources, the battle for the central citadel has been finished today. The Russians secured this territory completely, but as for now, without proofs. Most likely they will publish several proofs during this upcoming weekend, and the Russians are regrouping right now before the beginning of further offensive in the direction of the southern micro districts of the city of Chasiv Yar. As for the Sivas direction, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received any special. As for the Liman direction, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians continued their pressure around the settlement of Tarskoye. I'll remind you that yesterday, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the village of Tarskoye was completely captured and secured by the Russians. During the previous day, we got several statements and reports from neutral mappers. Neutral mappers reported that the Russians probably managed to establish control just over 50 or 60% of this village of Tarskoye, and that the southern part of the settlement is still under complete Ukraine control. As for now, we are not adjusting the map. We are going to keep the map according to the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation report, but if we get additional updates, of course we will adjust the map. Once again, we have some doubts as well that the Russians established control over the southern part of the settlement as well. So anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next. But obviously, even if the Russians haven't established control over the southern part, most likely the Russians are planning to do this in the very near future. As for the northern directions, we haven't received anything special. The Russians continue their offensive operation with the purpose to create secure zone. As for now, and as for the previous 24 hours, the group of forces Kursk or the group of forces North were regrouping, finalizing all the necessary things before the beginning of another major offensive operation. I'll remind you that according to current Istanbul demands and Istanbul talks, the Russians demand Ukrainians' complete withdrawal of their troops from this area. Of course, as for now, Ukrainians will reject this proposal, this demand, but we'll see what is going to be next. And that's it for today. Military of Samurai channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.